Hi, my name is Bob Tabor, and in this course, you'll learn about JavaScript, the language. This course is aimed at those who are absolute beginners, so beginners to JavaScript, and frankly, given that we're going to discuss some very basic things like if statements and for loops, it's really designed for those who are beginners to programming in general. So if you know some HTML and some CSS and you want to learn JavaScript, awesome, you're in the right place. Also, there's nothing specific to Windows in this course. The tools that I use will be free and available in Mac and Linux as well. So you should be able to follow along no matter which operating system you're comfortable with using. Now, my background is really not all that important, but in case you're curious, I am a software developer by day, and by night I run a website called Developer University, or DevU. You can visit me at www.devu.com. Occasionally Microsoft invites me to create courses, and what you see here is a collaboration between myself and the good folks at Microsoft Virtual Academy. I've been creating courses like this since 2004, and I created a very successful version of a JavaScript course way back in 2011. It's been viewed millions of times, and I've gotten a lot of very positive feedback about it. This is a rewrite, a complete rewrite of that course. Because frankly, JavaScript has changed dramatically in the 6 or 7 years since I originally recorded that course. And so if you're already a software developer coming from a different programming language, this is kind of to pick back up what I said earlier, this might move a little bit slow for you. It just wasn't designed with you in mind. There might be some other courses that can move you through the introductory material a little bit more quickly than what I plan on, than the pace that I plan to take with this course. And my focus is the JavaScript language, the pure language, not web development necessarily, although we will discuss JavaScript in the context of the web browser at the very end of this course. But I felt like teaching JavaScript and how it's implemented in the web browser clouded the discussion of JavaScript, the language itself. So we're going to be writing what amounts to console, or rather command line style applications to isolate JavaScript, the language, as purely and simply as possible without clouding it with a bunch of HTML and CSS and things like that. We're going to discuss the language. We'll discuss popular patterns that have emerged from the JavaScript development community to help overcome some of the challenges associated with working with such a highly dynamic language. Such a unique language and sometimes kind of a quirky language. The last time that I recorded the course about JavaScript way back in 2011, the course actually had a fairly long shelf life, and so much has changed with JavaScript since then that it necessitated that I actually play catch up and kind of learn some of the new features that were added because I wasn't keeping my skill set up. That's how quickly things change out from under you if you're not careful. If you know anything about JavaScript, you know that the community around JavaScript is moving extremely quickly. It's the most popular programming language, not just in the web browser, where there are hundreds of JavaScript frameworks and libraries that you can leverage in your own applications. But it's also becoming one of the most popular languages for server-side web development, meaning the code that actually runs on a web server that can perform business logic, that can interact with data storage, databases and other styles of data storage. And we're not going to talk about any of those topics in depth per se, but it is important to know that it all starts with a basic understanding of the things that we will discuss in this course, the absolute basics of JavaScript. So since this course may have a long shelf life, it's important to know that some of the features of the latest version of JavaScript, which I will be covering in this course, may not yet be implemented in all web browsers, depending on when you view this course. And then you have to take into account that some of the people viewing your website, for example, might be using very old web browsers. And so you have to keep that in account as well. So I'm going to make two general suggestions, and I'm going to try to remind you about these at the very end. There are still people on the internet that are viewing web pages with browsers that were created 10 years ago. So clearly in these cases, the newer features of JavaScript, many of which we'll discuss in this course, will not be available in those browsers, and your JavaScript won't even work in those web browsers. So you have a choice at that point. You can go one of two routes. You can either attempt to write your code in such a way that it is as friendly as possible to those older web browsers. Or you can use a tool which will transpile your JavaScript code that you write using the latest features of JavaScript. It'll transpile it back into a version of JavaScript that is compatible with all web browsers, even those that were built 10 years ago. And it uses a combination of techniques to accomplish this. We're not going to get into any of those. But if you want to take the first tact, if you want to be careful with the JavaScript that you write and only use those original features, I guess you can say, of JavaScript, or the early features of JavaScript, there's a website for you. You want to take a look at this website called Can I Use? And so we can take a look at maybe one of the newer features of JavaScript, the let keyword. I'll type it in here in the search box, Can I Use? And it will show us the let keyword, gives a quick description of what it is, and then it will show for the current versions of each of the web browsers whether it's supported or not. And you can see that the let keyword does have wide adoption across all modern web browsers, with a couple of exceptions. Now, if you want to go ahead and use the absolute latest version of JavaScript, and then take that second tact where you transpile your code so that it's backwards compatible with as many versions of the various web browsers as possible, then you want to check out a website and a tool actually called Babel.js. So you can find it at babeljs.io, and it will again use a combination of techniques to take your code. And you can see some of this little animation that's on the page right now. You can actually use this to type in some code here and see how it converts it into the older style JavaScript. And I'm not going to cover how to use Babel in this course, but you should know up front that writing JavaScript for web browsers requires that you give some careful thought to how your JavaScript will ultimately be consumed and who your targets are. And that definitely means that you're going to have to take into consideration the fact that some people will be using older web browsers. But writing JavaScript that will run on a web server using a framework like Node.js is a bit easier because, well, you're going to have some upfront knowledge about where that code will ultimately be executed. But this is not a course specifically about Node.js either, even though we're going to use Node.js as a lightweight means of executing these little tiny JavaScript examples that we're going to create throughout this course. So you're going to learn enough about Node.js to be able to write a simple tiny application, but it won't do anything cool like serve up a web page. However, I'm sure there are other courses here on Microsoft Virtual Academy and elsewhere that will help you kind of take that next step. So the game plan for this course is to start in the very next video by installing the tools that you'll need to get started. And then we're going to start with the absolute ABCs of JavaScript and programming in general. And I encourage you to follow along by typing in the code that I type in the video. And that's, typing it yourself is the absolute best way to learn. It starts to develop muscle memory. You'll have many of those aha moments where you realize, oh, I see how these two things are related. You can hear it, and that's one thing, but to type it in and to see it on your own computer working is something entirely different. I highly recommend that you become an active learner by typing in the code yourself. But I encourage you also to pause and rewind the video as many times as you need. This isn't a race. You don't consume these kinds of videos the same way you would watch a TV show, a movie, or a YouTube video. If something's not clear to you, don't just let it go in one ear and out the other and worry and say, I'll figure it out later. No, stop down and figure it out now, because you never know. It might be something foundational you'll need to know in the next lesson and the next lesson. But by the end of this course, you're going to be well positioned to move on to a more advanced JavaScript course to learn how to use modern client frameworks like React and Vue and Angular. Or you'll be well positioned to learn more about server-side frameworks and libraries like Node.js and Express.js and others. But no matter what, you're going to have a great foundation to build on. If something I say doesn't make sense, again, I can't stress this enough, seek out other sources online. And you're going to ultimately want to know something from me. I've recorded enough of these courses. I know the questions that are already coming. You're going to ask me if there's a book that goes along with this course that I could recommend. And I'm sorry, I don't really have a specific recommendation. Honestly, my recommendation is that you exhaust the dozens, if not hundreds, of JavaScript online resources where you can simply use them for free and find them in an instant if you want to get more explanation about any given idea that's covered in this course. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I want to encourage you to take your time. Don't feel overwhelmed. Stick with JavaScript, stick with this course, and you're going to be well rewarded, I promise. It'll be more difficult than playing a video game, than watching a movie or reading a book, but I promise you, you're going to wind up enjoying it even more than any of those things. Even if I wasn't paid to write code, I would do it because it's fun, it's mentally challenging, and you get this rush whenever you write code and you see it working and you're like, wow, this is awesome. So I'm glad you're going to get an opportunity to do that. It's the most fun you're going to have on a computer, I promise, and you'll wind up enjoying it. So stick with it, and I'll try to encourage you along the way. All right, so we'll get started in the next video. See you there. Thanks. All right, so let's get started. We're going to install the tools that we're going to need for the remainder of this course. Fortunately, we don't need a lot, and everything is free. And everything I show you will work regardless of which operating system you currently have installed. So regardless of whether you're using Windows, Mac, or Linux, everything I show you will be available for those platforms. The first thing we're going to need is a web browser. I'm pretty sure you already have one of those installed. Any will do. I would probably recommend that you either use Microsoft Edge or you use Google Chrome. The second tool that we're going to need to install is Node. It is the JavaScript runtime. It's what will actually execute the code that we write. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. And then we're going to need an authoring tool, something where we can actually type the code in. Now, in the past, I've used Notepad to actually demonstrate, because I didn't want to recommend one tool over the other, but then Microsoft came out with Visual Studio Code. It's available on all three platforms. So it's also available for free. So no matter what you're using, you should be able to download it and follow along. Now, you may already have a favorite tool for creating web pages and so forth. Feel free to use that. I'm not going to do anything that's so Visual Studio Code specific that it will exclude you. Please follow along no matter what tool you prefer. But let me put in a good plug for Visual Studio Code. I've been using it pretty much as one of my exclusive tools in my full-time job for the last 3 months, and it's really good. So I highly recommend it. Let's get started. We're going to need Node, and you may already have Node installed. So let's just see if you do or not. Let's go, and in Windows, I'm going to open up a command prompt, and I'm going to type in node-v. If I had Node installed, it would display the version of Node that I currently have installed. I don't have Node installed on this computer, so I get an error message. That's good. So to begin, we're going to go to Node.js. If I can type, there we go, nodejs.org. And again, regardless of which operating system you're using, you should be presented with an opportunity to download either the supported version or the current version, which has like the latest features. You don't need that. Just use the LTS version, which is recommended for most users. As long as you're using the version that I'm using or greater, we should always be in sync. Again, we're not going to use any really advanced features of Node, so this shouldn't really matter much. I'm going to go ahead and run it, run the installer here. What you see next, depending on which operating system you're using, you may see something a little bit different than what I see on screen, but hopefully you've installed things frequently enough that you can work your way through it. So here we have the Node.js setup wizard, and I'll just walk my way through, agree to the license. I'm going to pick a place on my hard drive to install this. There are some options. I'm not going to really do much of anything, but I do want to make sure that in Windows that this is added to my path. This will make sure that Node is available in any directory of my hard drive. So when I type in Node V from anywhere in my command prompt, it'll pop up. Okay, so just make sure that everything is selected and you'll be fine. It's not that large. Next, I'm going to have to agree to Windows UAC. You may see something different here on the Mac or Linux. I'm going to go ahead and agree to that little security prompt. And it only takes a minute or two to install Node, and then we'll move on. But basically, Node, in a nutshell, is the V8 JavaScript engine that they ripped out of Chrome. They added some tooling around it to support things for like HTTP, working with requests and responses, and with the file system. And they created one of the most robust web server tools that is available today, and many large applications are using Node currently to host their applications. We're not going to use it for that. We're going to use it for something much more mundane, which is to really just write out little text messages to a console window as we get started. Then we'll graduate on and use it in web pages much later in this course. All right, so I should have it installed, right? So I come over here and it still says it's not installed. I'm going to have to reboot my computer. So let's pause. I'm going to pause the recording of the video right here. I'm going to reboot, and then when I come back in, we should be able to move on from there. All right, so I've rebooted. Let's open up a command prompt, type in node-v, and I can see the version number, so we're successful. The next step is to install Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is different than the full version of Visual Studio, so Visual Studio Community, Professional, or Enterprise. Visual Studio Code is a lighter weight code editor, mainly used for web development, but I know people that use it to develop C# applications and other type of applications where you can use the command line tools to compile your code and things of that nature. That's not something I would ever want to do. It's great for web development, and that's what we're going to use it for authoring our JavaScript files and then executing Node commands in a built-in little command window, command prompt like we see there. Again, available for all operating systems. You just go to code.visualstudio.com. It should be able to detect which operating system you're currently using, and it gives you a download option for that. All right, and we're going to go ahead and run it in place. Again, Windows UAC prompts me to make sure that I am authorized to install it. We get to the code setup wizard. I'm going to go ahead and accept the agreement, and we're going to work our way through the defaults. Sure. And you can see that we can also add Visual Studio Code to the path, which will become available after restart. I don't need that necessarily for this course, but hey, you know, it doesn't hurt. In fact, let's go ahead and use it for everything here. That's up to you. You can read those options and choose what you want, but for my purposes, this will work just great. And we'll see throughout this course some of the things that Visual Studio Code will do for us as we're typing our code. Simple things like code coloring and code completion, managing our files, giving us an environment to execute command line tools like the Node command line tool. And there are many things like that, IntelliSense, others that will give us the tools to hopefully allow us to author our JavaScript code accurately. So let's go ahead and launch it. And let's just do what I call a quick smoke test. And we don't need Get for this course. I'm just going to hit close on that. So what we'll do is go to the Explorer. It's the little icon in the upper left-hand corner here. Let me kind of pull this out and make this a little bit sized a little bit more nicely here. Great. I'm going to close down the welcome screen. I am going to click Open Folder, and I'm going to go on. For me, I'm going to go to my C drive, and I'm going to create a source folder. Now, depending on your operating system or what your preferences are, you may want to create a folder somewhere else. But create a folder because we're going to put some some JavaScript files and later some HTML and CSS files in that folder, and we're going to want a folder structure. So right here in the open folder dialog, I'm going to right click and select new folder. I'm going to call this source, lowercase s and source, and then select that folder. Now that becomes the working folder that I'm going to use to add additional files and all the work that we do for this course inside of there. Here, it doesn't really wants me to put git, install git, and I don't want to do that. What I really want to do is go to terminal, all right, and depending on which operating system you're installed on, you might see something different here. In Windows, you see PowerShell. It doesn't really matter as long as you get a command prompt. And here I'm going to type node-v, and I can see that. That's awesome. And then what I want to do is add a file inside of this folder, this working folder. So I'm going to click on this little file with a plus symbol in the upper left-hand corner. I'm going to type in app.js, and it opens up a new file here in the main area with a little JS icon right next to it. And here I'm going to type all lowercase console.log hi. I'm going to go to the end and hit a semicolon. So let's kind of walk through this. The word console, a period on your keyboard, the word log, L-O-G, and then an opening and closing parenthesis. Inside of there, I want to put an opening single quote mark and a closing single quote mark, and then some word. I put hi, you could put your first name. It really doesn't matter. But what does matter to me, at least, is that you end it with a semicolon. And as you're going to come to learn, writing code is an exercise in precision. If you don't write exactly what I write, there's a chance that you will not get the results that I get. And so you want to double check and make sure there's not extra spaces. You want to double check to make sure that you're using the right characters. Like, this is not a comma, it is the period on the keyboard. All right. This is not a curly brace, it is a parenthesis. This is not a double quote, although that would be acceptable. In this particular situation, I would prefer if you used a single quote, which is on the same key, you just have to hold down the shift key, all right, to get to it. All right. So now I'm going to use Control S on my keyboard to save, or it might be Command S if you're on the Mac or something else on Linux. I don't know, whatever you use. Or you can just go File, Save. All right, now watch what happens when I just use the space bar on the keyboard. Did you notice, see that little symbol there? It went from X to a circle. That means that file has not been saved yet. That change that I made is not saved. So here again, I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut to save it. Then I'll come back down here into the terminal. Now, how can I do this easily? Well, on Windows, the keyboard shortcut is Control and then the back tick. That's usually next to the number 1, kind of to the left of it on most keyboards. So the back tick will close and open up that little terminal window at the bottom. And now I can type in node space, and then I want to use the name of this file, so app.js. And hit enter on my keyboard, and it should print out that word, hi, that I have inside of those 2 single quote marks in console.log, all right? Now, we can also shorten this up, node space app. We don't have to use the file extension, and it will work as well. All right, so assuming that you were able to follow along and you got to this step, then you're ready to move forward, and we're ready to get started actually writing some JavaScript. Let's start that process in the next video. We'll see you there. Thanks. So our job as software developers is to author code which is using a language that's human readable, and author in such a way that can be understood and parsed and interpreted and ultimately then executed by a computer. And the code that we write, we save into files, and we ask some execution environment, whether it be a web browser or in this case Node, to take a look at this code that we wrote in this file and to interpret it and to execute it. All right. And so it's important, first of all, as we get started, understand that how our code is going to be used. We're working and learning the JavaScript language, but ultimately the code that we write will be executed in, let's be honest, one of two, maybe even a third environment. We're either going to write JavaScript code that will ultimately be executed in Node, and typically when we're writing code for node-based applications, we're writing applications that can access the file system, access the network, respond to HTTP requests, and provide an HTTP response, things that are more server-side in nature, all right? And then we'll also then write JavaScript code that will execute in the context of a web browser. And we would expect for that code to be able to dynamically interact with elements, HTML elements on a given web page. All right, but we might also use JavaScript to write video games in an environment like Unity, for example, and be able to author and control the various objects on screen and their animation and their interaction and so on. So what I'm trying to get at here is that there's a difference between the language itself and then the environment that it runs inside of. And we need to be aware of that those are two separate things, even though sometimes they feel like one thing. In this case, console, for example, the console.log function is provided to us by Node. It allows us to tell Node that we want to print something to the command line like we did just a moment ago. Now there's also a console.log function in most web browsers, and it allows us to print little debugging messages or console messages that can only be viewed inside of a web browser whenever we have the developer tools open. And we'll see how to do that much later in this course once we start building web pages and JavaScript that can interact with them. But at any rate, let's get back to the matter at hand here. If I write my JavaScript incorrectly, then the runtime, whether it's Node or a web browser, won't be able to compile it, and it'll give us an error. And so JavaScript is similar to English in so much that JavaScript has a syntax, and it has a proper syntax versus a syntax that's incorrect. So if you've ever taken an English class, you'll know that there are parts of speech that you're supposed to use punctuation at the end of a sentence to indicate the end of a complete thought. There are nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs and prepositions and all these sorts of things, right? And so, in general terms, the same thing is true with JavaScript. There are parts of speech. We'll talk about those. And so you will be learning a new language, starting with your ABCs and with I guess vocabulary words, so to speak, and then to move on to authoring sentences that are complete thoughts, and then stringing those sentences together into paragraphs in order to accomplish some higher level task, and even kind of arranging those paragraphs together to create entire applications. All right, so hopefully that analogy will serve you well as we get started here. Our goal as we get started is to author JavaScript statements, and a statement is basically just one complete instruction. It's like a sentence in English, and each JavaScript file that we create, like this app.js, it'll contain one or more JavaScript statements that will execute in sequential order from top to bottom, at least usually. And I'll talk about the exception to that as we get further into this course. But there are some other similarities between JavaScript and English. For example, there's an end-of-line character. I was very, very specific about adding that semicolon at the end of our statement. And that just is an indication to the compiler that this is a complete thought and it should be carried out as is. All right. Now, we also see that we have our statement all on one line of code. And generally speaking, as we're getting started, we're going to write our JavaScript statements one per line. Now we'll bend those rules as some of our statements become very long. We can actually, for readability's sake, from a human perspective, we can split things up onto multiple lines if we need to. JavaScript, specifically Node, doesn't really care about that. That's really more for human readability. It can deal with multiple lines or a single line for a given statement. But be that as it may, we're going to try to strive at the beginning to write one statement per line in our files. And a statement usually consists of one or more expressions. So we'll talk about expressions a little bit later, but this particular expression is essentially just executing a function that's built into Node. It's the log function. It belongs to an object called console. We'll talk about objects and functions a little bit later here. And we execute it by using operators. Those, in this particular case, this is the function invocation operator or the method invocation operator. It's those open and closing parentheses. And we can even then pass in what are called arguments to those functions. So you can see that each little piece of this has a name and it has a role to play in creating our functions, and we'll learn more about that as we move on here. One thing to note is that JavaScript is case sensitive, and this trips up a lot of people to begin with. That's why I was very specific to say, hey, don't accidentally or mindlessly use capital letters. Make sure everything is lowercase. Let's see what happens if I were to save this work that I did here with the capital C in console and the capital L in log. Let's go node space app and hit enter, and we get a reference error. Console is not defined. It's not defined inside of Node. Console doesn't exist with a capital C inside of Node. It exists with a lowercase c inside of Node. The same thing is true with the function name log. Let's go ahead and I'll just use the up arrow on my keyboard. That'll give me the last command that was used in the terminal. So again, node app, and I'm going to try to execute this little program again, and I get another error. This time console.capital log is not a function. That's true. It's because it's lowercase l in log, and I'll save that change and then we'll re-execute this and it will work. Now there are some things that, especially when your application is small, don't matter. So you might have accidentally left off that semicolon at the end and the application still runs, but that's a bad practice to rely on that. You should always try to create properly formed sentences, even though you could write an English sentence or a text message that somebody could understand that has no punctuation, has no capital letters and things of that nature that would make it a well-formed English sentence. And you're relying on the person receiving that text message to understand what you're trying to say. The computer doesn't work that way. It needs to know exactly what you're saying, and so you have to be precise. Precision is the key as a software developer. All right, so what I want to do here as we kind of start wrapping things up for this first foray into JavaScript, I'm going to comment out this line and add some new code below it and use that as kind of the next step beyond where we're at right now. So to tell the compiler to ignore a line of code, I'm going to add a code comment. And here I use 2 forward slashes. I added also a space, but that was really just for readability's sake, so that myself as a human, I can kind of make an easy distinction, because sometimes all these characters run together. I like adding a space between this. But these two characters say, forget everything on this line of code. Don't compile it. Don't try to use it. All right. And we'll see in a moment that there's another way to create code comments as well. But here, let's create something a little bit more interesting. I'm going to say let x equal 7. I'm going to say let y equal 3. Let z equal x plus y. And then we'll do console.log. And then I'm going to use open and close parentheses. I'm going to use a single quote. I'm going to type in the word answer, colon, space. I'm going to go outside of that quote. So I'm going to go between the closing single quote and the closing parenthesis, and I'm going to make some space for myself in there. I'm going to use the plus key, or the plus operator, and the letter Z. I'm going to go to the end of the line and use the end of line character, the semicolon. I'm going to save it all. Now, before we actually execute this, what do you think this will do? What do you think will be printed to our console window? Do you have any guesses? Well, I'm betting that your background in math or algebra probably will lead you to the correct answer. And I think that your intuition in many cases is something that's important as you're learning JavaScript. It is human readable. It should be somewhat understandable. It might require a little extra explanation because there's some things that are not extremely obvious, but for the most part, this shouldn't blow you away, and nothing we cover should ever blow you away. It just might require a little extra effort than you're normally used to putting into things, but by no means impossible, right? So just take some comfort that this is well-traveled ground and that if I can understand it, I promise you can too. Let's run the application and see that we get the correct result, which is answer colon space and the number 10. So how do we get that? Well, we have something here, let x. And even though, again, you're not a JavaScript developer, or an advanced JavaScript developer just yet, I'm willing to bet that you understood that we were creating a variable, essentially, a bucket that could contain a value. And immediately we set that variable equal to the value 7. And then we did the same thing with the value of 3. We put that into a different variable, a different bucket called y. And then here we have an expression that will add two values together. What are the values inside of those variables x and y? Well, we just assign them in lines 3 and 4. And we know that that probably means we're going to add those together to get the result of 10. And we assign that into a new bucket, a new variable named z. And then we merely print out that literal string. But then we also say also append the letter or the value that's in z. Now, hopefully that made sense to you even before we ran the application. But you can see here that, for example, the plus symbol has double duty. It's serving to be the addition operator, but it's also serving to concatenate two values together. In this case, two string values together so that we can print it out to screen. So we're going to use this kind of as a starting point and talk about this at more length in the next and subsequent videos. But hopefully up to this point, you get some comfort level. You're writing some code. You're getting your hands dirty in the code. And, I know you can do this. So just keep pushing forward and let's pick it up in the next video. We'll see you there. Thanks. In this video, I want to continue talking about line number 3 so that we completely come to a full understanding of what variables are in JavaScript. So I'm going to add a new file, and I'm going to do that by hovering over the source tab of the Explorer. And I want to type in variables.js, like so. And then I'm just going to copy in the code that we had here. We'll use this as a starting point. All right, so let's focus in on line number 1. Let's just, first of all, let's make sure this still runs, and let's go node, and this time we're going to give it the new file name variables. And we get the same result as before. Great. So what is a variable? I think I said at the very end of that previous lesson that a variable is basically just an area in the computer's memory where we're storing a value. We're requesting or declaring our need for a new variable, a space in the computer's memory where we can put information and retrieve information. And then we can, from that point on, continue to use that variable to store different values and retrieve those values back out throughout the lifespan of the application. So there are actually several different parts to the variable declaration statement in line number 1. The first is the let keyword. And let's start talking about the parts of speech in JavaScript. A keyword is something like let, and we'll see some other examples a little bit later, but essentially think of it like a verb in the English language. It's an instruction to the JavaScript compiler that we want to do something, that we want to take action. So we want to create a variable with the name of X, and we're expressing that intent to JavaScript using the let keyword. All right. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part is the name of the variable that we want. So we're requesting that a area of storage, a unit of storage is assigned to our application where we can put things. But how do we reference that? Again, it needs a name so that we can get the values and put new values in memory. All right. And so that's usually called an identifier. We want to declare a new variable with the identifier of X. And we're going to talk about naming our identifiers, naming our variables. There's some rules and some conventions that we need to follow as developers. All right, we'll come back to that at the very end of this lesson. Now, before we get too far, there's actually a couple of different ways to declare a variable in JavaScript. The original keyword that you'll see used in 99% of all tutorials and articles and books and videos is the var keyword. And until recently, this was the only way that you could declare a variable. In the latest version of JavaScript, however, the recommendation is to abandon var unless you really need it. Use the let keyword instead, or the const keyword, which we'll talk about in just a moment. If we were to save our application using the var keyword in line number 1 and then rerun it, nothing would change. So what's the problem with var? There are some, well, I guess there's two ways to kind of explain it at this point. The first is that its usage is very nuanced. It does stuff that somebody new to JavaScript may not anticipate the ramifications of until it's too late and there are problems in code. We'll talk about the var keyword and how it relates to scope and so on in an upcoming video, but we need to introduce some more concepts before we can get to the point where that discussion is even interesting. Okay, so its usage is nuanced and the ramifications can be pretty challenging if you're just getting started. So that's why the people who decided what goes into JavaScript said, why don't we introduce a new keyword called let? It will work like most other programming languages. As you try to learn JavaScript, hopefully it won't be problematic. So that's why we have the let keyword. The other keyword for declaring a variable is const. And we use that whenever we want to express our intent to the JavaScript compiler that we do not intend for that variable to ever change its value. So what we initialize the value to, in this case to 7, we wouldn't expect that to change throughout the lifetime of the application. And if we try to change it, like in the very next line of code, we can attempt to set it equal to 6. I'll save that. Let's go over and try to run that code. We're going to get an error, and it actually is pretty helpful. It gives a little caret right underneath the equal sign, and it says assignment to constant variable. That's the problem. And the issue here is that we've said to JavaScript, we never want to change that value, and then the very next line of code we say, yeah, I'm going to assign it a new value and set it equal to 6, and it says can't do that. Okay, so for the most part, we're going to use the let keyword most of the time because that's the recommendation now as we learn JavaScript. All right, so just want to point out that we can uncomment out line number 2 as we assign the value of X to different values. And we can keep doing this as many times as we want to. So at this point in line number 1, we've declared the variable, set it to 7, then we've assigned it the value of 6, then 5, then 4. We can keep changing the value in the computer's memory. And what is the value in line number 6? What's X's value? Well, the last time we assigned a value to it was 4. So the application now, whenever we run it, will give us 7 because 3 plus 4 equals 7, right? So that's what we get in line number 7. Great. All right, so I guess this should be obvious at this point. The equal sign here is actually what's called an assignment operator. This is how we assign a value into a variable. And we can keep assigning values as many times as we want, but we can only declare a value or variable one time. So if I were to try and come down here and say let X equals 7 again, or let it equal 8, I'm going to get an error. whenever I try to run the application, the identifier x has already been declared. Again, you can only declare a variable once, but you can assign its value as many times as you want to after that. All right. So in line number 1, not only are we declaring the variable, then we're also assigning its value right off the bat in the same line of code. And when we do that, it's a technique called initialization. This is actually 2 lines of code rolled up into one. Lines number 1 and 2 now are roughly equivalent to what we had before. Well, roughly equivalent. There is one difference here. At the end of the execution of line number 1, what is the value of x? Well, let's find out. Console.log, and then we'll just say, what's the value of x at this point? And then let's run the application. And you can see that first value that's output above what we get now in line number 11 is